If these walls could talk, they wouldn't shout. They'd whisper. They'd whisper about late nights and early mornings. They'd whisper about busted knuckles, the smell of Swarfega hand cleaner, and the metallic tang of blood mixed with grease. This is Frank's church, a two-car garage behind a modest ranch house in suburban Ohio. It's not much to look at from the outside. The siding is faded beige, the roof needs new shingles next year. But inside is a sanctuary dedicated to American iron. Frank is 72 years old. He's the kind of man built from the same stuff that used to make bridge girders out of. He doesn't talk much because he figures most things don't need saying. He worked 45 years as a master machinist at a tool and die shop. He spent his life making things fit together with tolerances tighter than a human hair. When he retired 7 years ago, the silence nearly killed him. His wife, Sarah, God rest her soul, she knew it would happen. 2 years before she passed from the cancer, she walked him out to the backyard, past the tomato plants, to the overgrown patch of weeds behind the shed. Under a heavy, mildewed tarp sat a shape. It was boxy. It was forgotten. "Frank," she had said, her voice already getting weak, "you're gonna need something to argue with when I'm gone. Might as well be this." He pulled back the tarp. It was a 1970 Chevrolet Nova. Now, to most folks, a '70 Nova isn't a dream car. It was the grocery getter, the commuter car, the car your aunt drove to church. This particular one was a disaster. The original pea soup green paint was mostly oxidized surface rust. The vinyl roof looked like cracked desert earth. Mice had built a civilization in the back seat. But Frank didn't see the rust. He saw the lines. He saw the potential. He saw the empty canvas of a GM X-body platform, light and rigid. When Sarah died, the silence in the house became deafening. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway felt like a hammer hitting an anvil. So Frank retreated to the garage. He didn't build this car with money. He didn't open a catalog and order a crate engine with a credit card. That's too easy. That's how they do it on television. Frank built this car with time. He spent the first year just on the body, not making it pretty, just making it solid. He cut out the cancer, the rust in the quarter panels, and welded in new steel, grinding the welds smooth until his fingers were numb. He didn't paint it a candy apple red. He didn't put racing stripes on it. He primed it a flat, unassuming shade of battleship gray. It looked like a shadow. It looked unfinished. And that was exactly the point. Frank hated flash. He hated chrome for the sake of chrome. In his world, form followed function. If it didn't make the car go faster, stop harder, or turn sharper, it didn't belong on the car. He left the stock steel wheels on it. He left the slightly pitted chrome bumpers. To anyone walking past his driveway, it was just an old man's junker that he couldn't afford to paint properly. They didn't know about the heart transplant. Let's talk about what Frank put under that hood, because that is the soul of this story. Frank was a machinist. He knew metal. He knew how to make air and fuel dance together under extreme pressure. He found an old 454 big block Chevy out of a rusted-out Suburban in a junkyard. He paid $400 for it. The block was solid, but the insides were shot. He took it to his old shop. He called in favors. He bored the cylinders out. He stroked the crank. He'd turned that 454 into a 496 cubic inch monster. He didn't buy fancy aluminum heads off the shelf. He took old cast iron oval port heads and spent 4 months in his garage with a die grinder, porting and polishing them by hand, smoothing the airflow paths until they felt like glass. It's an art form that is dying out. It's the difference between buying speed and creating it. He put a camshaft in it that was so aggressive it sounded like the engine was angry at the world just for idling. When you started that Nova, It didn't purr. It didn't hum like these modern plastic-covered engines. It choked. It coughed. It shook the entire car side to side. It sounded like a thunderstorm trapped in a steel box. It had a deep, rhythmic thump, thump, thump that you felt in your chest more than you heard with your ears. It was uncomfortable. It smelled like high-octane gasoline and hot oil. It was hot, loud, and violent. And Frank loved it. It took him 5 years. 5 years of scraping knuckles, 5 years of figuring things out, 5 years of grieving Sarah through the therapy of turning wrenches. When it was done, on the outside, it was a gray, unassuming 1970 Nova sitting on cheap tires. On the inside, it was a 12-second guided missile disguised as a grocery getter, a true sleeper. Frank didn't take it to car shows. He didn't pop the hood for neighbors. He just took it out on Saturday evenings when the air began to cool down. He'd drive it to the edge of town where the industrial parks replaced the subdivisions, and he'd just listen to the engine breathe. It was his connection to a time when things were simpler, a time when you could fix your own problems with a wrench set and some common sense, a time before everything became computerized, sanitized, and plastic. The world had changed around Frank. He watched it happen from his garage door. Cars didn't have carburetors anymore. They had fuel injection systems managed by 3 different computers. You couldn't even change your own battery in some new cars without resetting the dealership software. And the drivers had changed too. Frank wasn't bitter, but he was observant. He saw a generation that valued the appearance of success over the foundation of hard work. They wanted the shortcut. They wanted the life hack. He saw them on the roads. Young men in cars that cost more than his house. Cars built by robots in Italy or Germany. Cars that could drive themselves, park themselves, and save you from your own bad driving decisions with traction control and stability assist. They were fast, incredibly fast. Frank knew that. He respected the engineering. But he didn't respect the drivers. They hadn't earned the speed. They had just financed it. It was a Saturday in late October. The air was crisp, the kind of dense, cool air that carbureted engines love because it's packed with oxygen. Frank decided to take the Nova out for its final run before winterizing it. He pulled on his old faded denim jacket, the one with the grease stain on the cuff that never came out. He turned the key. The big block cranked slowly. High compression fighting the starter. Then it caught. Boom! The garage shook. The idle settled into that familiar, aggressive, choppy rhythm. The smell of unburnt hydrocarbons filled the air, the perfume of the 1970s. Frank backed out of the driveway, the heavy mechanical linkage of the transmission clunking into reverse. He headed towards Route 23, a 4-lane stretch of blacktop that ran past the new Amazon distribution centers and out toward the vacant farmland. It was wide, flat, and usually empty on a Saturday evening. He was cruising in the right lane, doing exactly the speed limit, 55 miles per hour. The windows were down. He was listening to the harmonies of the exhaust bouncing off the concrete dividers. He was content. And then he heard it. It sounded like an angry mosquito amplified through a stadium speaker system, a high-pitched screaming whine that was getting louder fast. Frank checked his rearview mirror. Something low, wide, and obnoxiously bright green was weaving through traffic behind him. It was a Lamborghini Huracan, lime green. It looked less like a car and more like a spaceship that had crash-landed on an Ohio highway. The driver was tailgating Frank, inches from his chrome bumper. Frank didn't speed up. He held his line. The Lamborghini jerked into the left lane and pulled up alongside. The driver couldn't have been older than 25. He had expensive sunglasses on even though the sun was setting. He was wearing a designer t-shirt that probably cost more than Frank's weekly grocery bill. One hand was casually draped over the top of the steering wheel. The other was holding up a smartphone, probably recording himself driving. He looked over at Frank in his primer gray Nova. He looked at the rust bubbling up around the rear wheel well. He looked at Frank's gray hair and denim jacket. And the kid laughed. It wasn't a friendly laugh. It was a laugh of pure, unfiltered arrogance. It was the laugh of someone who believes newer is always better and expensive means superior. He revved his engine. The V10 screamed a high-tech, computer-controlled shriek. It was impressive noise, but it had no soul. Frank just looked straight ahead. He didn't acknowledge him. Up ahead, the traffic light at the intersection of Industrial Parkway turned yellow, then red. Frank began to slow down, downshifting the heavy transmission. The Big 8 popped and crackled on deceleration. The Lamborghini pulled up right next to him in the left lane. They were sitting at the line. The cross traffic was empty. The road ahead was a mile of straight, empty asphalt. The kid in the Lambo rolled down his passenger window. He leaned across the seat. "Hey, Pops," he yelled over the idle of the engines. "Nice tractor. You need a push to get that junk heap moving?" Frank slowly turned his head. He looked the kid right in the eyes. Frank's face was a road map of 72 years of life, weathered, calm, and completely unimpressed. Frank didn't say a word. He just reached down to the dashboard. He flipped a small, unmarked metal toggle switch. Click. Under the back of the Nova, a high-volume electric fuel pump whined to life, sounding like a dentist drill. He was priming the system, feeding the thirsty carburetors. Frank wrapped his calloused hands tightening around the thin steering wheel. The kid in the Lambo saw the old man tighten up. He laughed again. He figured the old man was delusional. He figured he was about to embarrass this relic of the past. The kid engaged his launch control. The Lamborghini's computers took over. The engine revved to a preset RPM, sounding like a chainsaw held wide open. The computer was calculating tire slippage, surface temperature, air density. Frank didn't have launch control. He had his right foot and 45 years of experience. He brought the RPMs up just a little. The whole car vibrated violently. The beast was waking up. They both stared at the red overhead light. Thump, thump. Thump, thump. Thump, thump. The light turned green.
The Lamborghini's computer dropped the clutch perfectly. It leaped off the line with a shriek of technological efficiency. All-wheel drive clawed at the pavement. It was fast, incredibly fast. But Frank didn't just floor it. If he had floored it, the 800 horsepower under the hood would have just turned his cheap street tires into white smoke, and he wouldn't have moved an inch. Frank finessed it. He rolled into the throttle, feeling the rear tires just on the edge of losing traction. He knew exactly how much torque the asphalt could handle before the tires broke loose. The Nova didn't leap, it squatted. The massive torque twisted the entire chassis. The front left tire actually lifted 2 inches off the ground. And then the noise. It wasn't a scream like the Lambo, it was a roar. A guttural, earth-shaking bellow from 8 massive cylinders firing in anger. Bwah! For the first 60 feet, the all-wheel drive Lamborghini jumped out half a car length ahead. The kid in the Lambo was already smiling. Then, Frank's rear tires hooked up completely. The G-force slammed Frank back into the bench seat. The speedometer needle swept past 40, past 50 in a blur. Frank slammed the shifter into second gear. Chirp! The rear tires screamed in protest as they caught second gear rubber. The Nova surged forward like it had been rear-ended by a freight train. The nose of the rusty gray Nova pulled even with the bright green door of the Lamborghini. The kid in the Lambo looked over, his eyes wide behind his sunglasses. The smile vanished. He was flooring it. His computer was doing everything perfectly. It didn't make sense. Frank looked over. He wasn't smiling. He was just working. He hit third gear. The roar deepened. The wind was howling through the open windows, mixing with the thunder of the exhaust. The Nova began to walk away, inch by inch, then foot by foot, then car length by car length. The brute force of 496 cubic inches of American iron, built by hand in a dimly lit garage, was absolutely devouring the finest technology Italy had to offer. By the time they hit 100 miles an hour, Frank was 3 car lengths ahead. The Lamborghini was a screaming green speck in his rearview mirror. Frank lifted his foot off the gas. The big engine wound down, popping and banging in triumph. He coasted. He had made his point.
Frank pulled up to the next red light a mile down the road. The adrenaline was humming in his veins, a familiar feeling he hadn't felt in years. He patted the dashboard gently, like he'd pat the neck of a good horse after a hard gallop. "Good girl, Sarah," he whispered. He named the car after her when he finished it. A moment later, the lime green Lamborghini pulled up slowly into the lane next to him. The engine noise of the exotic car seemed quieter now, more subdued. Frank looked over. The kid had taken his sunglasses off. He looked pale. He looked confused. His worldview, that money equals speed, that new equals better, had just been shattered by a 50-year-old gray brick on wheels. The kid didn't rev his engine. He didn't laugh. He just looked at Frank, looked at the rust on the fender, and then slowly, hesitantly, gave a thumbs up. It was a small gesture, but it was genuine. It was respect. Frank gave a single, slow nod back. The light turned green. The Lamborghini pulled away normally, turning left toward the highway. Frank turned right, heading back toward the quiet suburbs. He drove slowly the rest of the way home. He didn't need to go fast anymore. He listened to the engine thump its steady rhythm. He pulled into his driveway as the sun was finally gone. He shut the engine off. The silence returned to the garage, but it didn't feel heavy anymore. The ticking clock inside the house wouldn't bother him tonight. He got out, smelling the hot oil and burnt rubber, the scent of victory. He wiped a smudge of grease off the fender with his thumb. They say you can't buy happiness, and that's probably true. But Frank knew something else was true too. You can't buy soul. You can't buy the feeling of building something with your own 2 hands. And you certainly can't buy the respect that comes from knowing exactly what you have because you were the one who put it there. Some folks see a rusty old car and they see junk. They see the past. Frank sees a sleeper. He sees a promise kept. And he knows that sometimes the most dangerous things on the road aren't the ones screaming for attention. They're the ones quietly waiting for the light to turn green.